much. Well, thank you so much for this great invitation and for the opportunity to come here today. I feel like I'm coming home. I love Bahrain. It's the most wonderful country in the region and in the whole world. You're small but mighty. You punch above your weight, as they always say. I love the food. I love the people. There's so many of my friends in the room. This just feels like a family gathering, like Thanksgiving dinner or something. So if a turkey comes in later, you'll understand why. But it really is wonderful, and thank you so much, Dr. Bendina. It was terrific to hear your comments. I'm humbled by the fact that in the United States we have Earth Day, and Bahrain has Earth Month. I mean, really. Again, punching above your weight. This is a lesson that we can learn from. And of course, I love the idea that there is a Supreme Council of the Environment. I mean, first of all, that makes it clear how important it is in the country, all kidding aside. But I must admit, when I was secretary of the California EPA, polluters might have taken me more seriously if I was the CEO of the Supreme Council of the Environment. So maybe I'll suggest a change in the future to that title. But again, I want to thank so much everybody who made this possible today for inviting me, and I think I've got a clicker here. So I'm going to do just a couple of slides here. First of all, again, I would like to thank our sponsors. I'd like to thank the American Chamber and everyone who made this possible. And of course, UNIDO, my dear friend, Dr. Hashem. Where is he? Where did he go? He disappeared. As usual, he's out networking and making things happen. So again, I really appreciate very much this opportunity. And as Bob said, I expect to learn as much as I might be able to impart from what we're doing. There he is. Let's give him another great big round of applause. UNIDO, especially under his guidance here in Bahrain, is a powerhouse within a powerhouse. So thank you so much. Before I get into a couple of things I want to demonstrate on the slides up here to stimulate some thinking and some discussion, I want to share with you something I found on the web, on the internet, from a tourist site from Australia. So this was a website where people could ask questions about Australia before going there as tourists. And these questions are real. They probably came from stupid Americans, to be honest. But they were answered in all sincerity by the Australians, and they illustrate what we're going to talk about today. So let me just give you 3 examples. One question, this is a real question. I have never seen it rain in Australia on television. How do the plants grow? And the answer, we import all plants fully grown and then just sit around and watch them die. The second one was, can you give me some information about hippopotamus racing in Australia? The answer, Africa is the big triangle-shaped continent south of Europe. Australia is the big island in the middle of the Pacific, which does not have, oh, forget it. Sure, the hippo racing is every Tuesday night in King's Cross. Come naked. And then my favorite of all of these was, and this is real, which direction is north in Australia? And the answer, face south and then turn 180 degrees. Contact us when you get here and we'll send you the rest of the directions. Now, I mention these because while they're funny, they exemplify the challenge that all of us face as we try to build more sustainable communities for the future. Most people don't understand the world we live in today. They don't understand because very often, if they can go to the supermarket, they can get food. They don't stop to think where it comes from or what had to be produced in order for it to get there. They go, as you know here, we have many representatives and sponsors here today from the oil and gas industry. You know, people only complain or stop to think about where their fuels come from if it's not available or if the price goes up. But otherwise, they just go to the gas station, the petrol station, and they expect to get their fuel and get in their car and keep going. So we tend to be very disconnected. We put our trash, our garbage into a can, it goes out to the curb somewhere and it gets collected, whether it's a business or a home, and we don't stop to think about what happens to that. So you can understand that people are somewhat lost in the cities and the environments we've created today, which is why it can be challenging, but it's also an enormous opportunity. I believe it's the biggest economic opportunity that our world has ever known, and I'll try to prove that claim. That's a little bit about me, and as you can see, I've written some books. I was talking to some folks in the green room before about the fact that some folks in the oil and gas industry might think that I'm the enemy because I've written books and made statements that are critical of the oil industry, and quite the opposite. I think the oil industry has the potential to build the green economy of the future more than any other industry. The gas industry, of course, in the United States today is converting all of our coal-fired power plants to run on natural gas, which is much, much cleaner and a lower greenhouse gas emissions. So as a transition fuel, that's an incredibly important contribution. My wife drives a natural gas powered car, which again is much cleaner and more sustainable. The Chevron, the big California oil company, is helping us build our hydrogen highway, which is a network of hydrogen fueling stations so that we can have hydrogen-powered electric cars. And nobody knows more about that industry than the oil and gas industry. So I think what you're going to see is that the biggest force for change, in fact, will be the oil and gas industry, and there again, an enormous economic opportunity. So what are some of the keys to having sustainable communities? So, you know, as I said, some people might be a little bit mystified about how their community really operates today, as those funny questions suggested. So I just put down here a few key attributes of sustainable communities. Healthy residents, I think everybody would agree on that health is an important measurement. A clean environment, well, of course. A strong economy, and a thriving entrepreneurial culture and opportunities from small and medium enterprises to global conglomerates. And then a few keys to building and supporting those sustainable communities include global partnerships for green policy, technology, and finance, such as our friends from UNIDO and the ITPO office and the regions of climate change, which I'm going to talk about here in a moment. And I do want to give a shout out to UNIDO and our dear friends at the ITPO here. As I said, I think they are one of the hidden treasures, maybe not so hidden thanks to Dr. Hashim and the fact that he's everywhere, and he's always working and always bringing people together. But this is an organization that we really need in every part of the country. The United States could really benefit from having an ITPO office in many of its communities. There are so many places. I mean, if you stop and think about some of the areas that need economic development even more than others. In the U.S., for example, Detroit comes to mind after the auto industry has had such huge problems. But really, everywhere in the world needs this kind of entrepreneurship and needs this kind of an organization that brings people together. So, again, I want to thank everybody at UNIDO. And then the R20. So the R20, as Bob mentioned, R stands for regional governments, and originally there were 20. So regional meaning states and provinces or smaller regional governments like Bahrain, even regional associations like GCC countries and whatnot. And originally there were 20, California, British Columbia from Canada, Delta State from Nigeria. Well, today we link over 500 subnational governments and national governments all over the world to share policy, technology, and finance. And the policy speaks for itself. Obviously, what works in one place to incentivize the green economy may work elsewhere. So we recently helped a state in Brazil that was trying to incentivize more solar energy. And they took a look at the California model for incentives to people to put solar on their rooftops. And we helped them take a look at the German feed-in tariff model and figure out what was best for them. We also certainly learn from each other's mistakes. The United States has made a lot of big mistakes on things like corn-based ethanol. And so we can learn from both our successes and our failures. We also try to share technology because government can't know what it doesn't know. So if government is trying to set a standard for efficient cars or lighting or buildings or how to deal with waste, if government officials don't know about the latest technology, what's economically viable and what's sustainable, well then obviously they can't push the policy in the right direction. So we try to share technology knowledge. And then finally, finance. And this to me is the real missing piece to moving toward economies and communities that are much more sustainable. because government has been working on this for a long time. Technology has certainly been there for a long, long time. Whether it's electric cars, whether it's turning waste into energy, whatever the technology might be, it's been there. But the financial community has always been reluctant. A friend of mine says, money is always scared. And so investors typically take a more wait-and-see attitude. They want to see long-term examples in government policy. They want to see long-term success with technology and large commercial scale before they'll invest. And we've seen a number of institutions in the UN and other places where reports suggest that investors, in order to build the green economy, should take lower returns and accept higher risk. Well, I know many of you work in the investment community or with the investment community. Raise your hand if you think the investment community should take higher risk and lower returns. Yeah, maybe not too many. Well, one or two. Okay, well that's all right. Well, that's laudable. But the truth is, when you're talking to pension funds, for example, they can't explain that to the pensioners. They can't say to their pensioners that if somehow they lose a quarter of the money because they took unacceptable risks or lower returns, well, you know what, your pension is going to be lower for the next 20 or 30 years. And other institutional investors, of course, have fiduciary responsibilities. So we try at the R20, we try to take a different approach. We say, how could you build the green economy if you got investors market risk and market returns? And we believe that now, because of advances in technology and policy and commercialization, that that's very possible. But it does take intermediaries and partnerships like the R20 and the work that UNIDO does, and I'll give you some examples. Let's talk about waste as one of the examples of a sustainable community. I think everybody understands renewable energy, everybody understands energy efficiency with LED light bulbs or putting in better insulation in your windows or your homes, but not many people really stop and think about waste. And I have to tell you, when we started the R20, and Governor Schwarzenegger and I would go around and talk to different governors and different mayors and different world leaders, and we would talk about these things. When you talk about an organization that's title is Regions of Climate Action, you would think that you're talking about renewables and energy efficiency and alternative fuels, maybe cap and trade systems or a carbon tax. But every single one of our meetings, those dignitaries would say to us, this is all great, but what do you have to help us deal with waste? And I don't care if it was in the US, if it was in Europe, if it was in South America, in Africa, in Asia, everybody is drowning in waste, as this slide would suggest. And think about how foolish that really is. I mean, for example, the oil industry here, think about how much work you have to go to get oil out of the ground, to transport it to somewhere where it can be refined into something useful, and then it gets put into vehicles or plastics or other kinds of things. But every day in our communities all over the world, we're taking oil and burying it. It's called a landfill. We're taking plastic and all kinds of other things made from this valuable, valuable feedstock, chemicals and plastics and so forth, and putting it into a landfill and then going around the world and digging it up again. Makes absolutely no sense when you think about how much oil and how many chemicals and all kinds of other resources we're going to need. So this is the current model. And again, I don't care what part of the world you're in. That picture on the lower right is here in the southern governorate of Bahrain, and you can see the piles of waste behind us, but it's the same in the United States, the picture in the upper corner there. It's the same everywhere you go. Too much waste goes to landfills. Instead, what we see is the idea of building a zero waste campus instead of a landfill. So you still collect it, you still take it to one place, but you use modern technology to sort everything and turn it back into its original product. So these plastic bottles that are made of PET plastic, valuable petroleum products, these can actually be cleaned and made back into flakes, at what we call Food and Drug Administration, FDA approved flakes that can be made back into these very same plastic bottles over and over again. And every other thing that is currently in those pictures, like this, everything you see up there, in fact, is a valuable feedstock. And how do you do it? So you build a facility where you sort everything, where you then recover it, and where it becomes these various products. So for example, the organics that come in, which can be everything from yard waste and agricultural waste, all the organics can be sorted and turned into all of these different products and services. And here, construction and demolition debris, which I think there's probably quite a lot of here. All of that can be turned back into building materials today, even things that are hard to recycle, like glass. And electronics. Electronics are an incredible storehouse of resources, of valuable minerals and materials, plastics and so forth, all of which can be turned back into valuable materials. And plastic bottles, as I mentioned, can be turned right back into plastic bottles. Of course, what happens is you save money. That's the first thing, and I'll give you an exact example of that. In Chicago, we recently did an estimate for them for a 2,000 ton a day material recovery facility. They're currently spending $85 a ton to take their waste to a landfill. We showed them how they could cut that to $15 a ton. And actually, the landfill where they're taking their waste today is about 80 miles outside of Chicago, and that will fill up in 2018, so they're going to have to go to a new landfill that's 180 miles outside of Chicago. So cities are facing increasing costs at a time when we can show them how to actually turn that liability into an asset. And of course, for the technology companies, it's really important. For those of you that are in technology companies, you understand you have to reduce your risk as well. And so if you have a technology that can convert, let's say again, let's use the example of these plastic bottles back into plastic bottles, you have two risks. One is that you can get enough waste plastic to be able to make your product. And the second is that you can get a bottling company like this to take your recycled material and put it into their new bottles. So it's the feedstock and the offtake agreements that you need. And by working with a local municipality, there's no question where the feedstock is going to come from. You're getting it trucked in there every single day, and as you saw from those photographs, today it's being buried. So instead you can have a consistent supply of that material. And then an offtake agreement, every part of the world has bottling companies that are all trying to brag about how much post-consumer material is in their plastic bottles, and so they desperately need that, and they're willing to sign those kinds of offtake agreements, again, if they're working in partnerships with the cities that are generating the waste in the first place. And here, for those of you who are into economics, here is a very simple summary of the cost. Now, a MRF, which is a material recovery facility, might cost $20 million to build a 2,000-ton facility, and that's actually going to cost you something if you're just collecting the material and sorting it. If that's all you do, as you can see, the EBITDA, as it's called, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So the net earnings is actually negative if you're just building the facility to sort everything. But it still reduces the cost as opposed to just paying to put it in a landfill. But it's when you then put all of these additional technologies to work and you invest in all of those other technologies to convert that waste material into something better, where you now create a profitable enterprise with a lot of jobs, a lot of new businesses, a lot of new entrepreneurs. And in Bahrain, I think you may remember a few years ago there was a deal made for an incinerator that was going to cost over $400 million. There was an agreement to pay the company over $100 a ton tipping fee. In other words, to take the waste in the first place. It would have generated a little bit of energy, but I think it was in fact the Supreme Council for the Environment which discovered that the emissions from this facility would be the same as a coal-fired power plant, so that wasn't very useful. And that actually 40% of the material would be ash, so it would still end up going to a landfill. Instead, if you look at that zero waste campus, if you were to do every single one of those items on here, you'd be spending about $120 million, and you'd actually have something that generates a profit and a lot of jobs and a lot of local businesses. So I guess the question is, what is the Bahrain, what is the world we really want to see in the future? And I think none of you would be here today if you didn't want the one that's on the right, if you didn't envision a much more equitable and healthy and sustainable community here, and you wouldn't have Environment Month instead of just Environment Day if you didn't believe it was possible. And the fact that so many investors are in the room today is extremely heartening to me, to see how many people understand that this is not just hugging the trees, as we say in the States. This is not just because we want to go green or because COP21 said we have to cut our greenhouse gases. This is because it makes good economic sense. So I thank you all for your participation today, and as Bob said, we do want this to be participatory and not just people up here talking heads, but there are real examples of these things. There's many more that I could talk about, and the need for these intermediaries to come in and introduce these ideas and put together these kinds of solutions, like a zero waste campus, instead of just seeing one or two pieces of that, like the project we did in Brazil, where we helped 13 cities replace 1.5 million streetlights with LEDs that save 67% of the energy. And we put together a special purpose finance vehicle. In this case, it was the finance that unlocked the opportunity to do that, because the cities didn't have the money to replace all of their streetlights at once. And by putting together a special purpose finance vehicle, the cities could borrow the money, replace all of their lights, immediately get the benefits, and then pay it back from the savings, which was about a 5-year payback for lights that are guaranteed 10 years and will probably last 12 or 15. So it ends up being good for the taxpayers, good for the local economy where they're manufacturing the streetlights in Brazil now, and obviously good for the planet, because you're not only cutting 67% of the energy use, but 67% of the emissions, greenhouse gas and other, that would have come from producing all that energy. But again, it took an organization like the R20 to come down there and put together the financial community with the technology and with the policymakers. So we know there's a role for these intermediaries to play, and we're very happy to be one of them. Shakespeare said, "Nature's bequest gives nothing, but doth lend. And so when nature calls thee to be gone, what acceptable legacy canst thou leave?" Well, the fact that all of you are here today and all of you here are committed to making Bahrain and the region a much more sustainable community for now and in the future means that I know you're going to leave a legacy of which even William Shakespeare would be proud. Thank you very much.
I wanted to touch on a couple of things you said. First of all, I love the fact that you show the Giza pyramids there, because prior to moving here 3 years ago, my wife, daughter, and I were living in Cairo. And Cairo is a great example in the waste management stream of a low-tech, high-efficient use of human capital. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Zabalin, who live in a particular part of town, most of them Copts, who go door to door and for a very small tippage fee will collect your garbage. And they are very efficient at finding what is reprocessable, repurposable, what is recyclable. And so you go to Marihad Nasser and see what they call the garbage city. Of course, once the government and the changes in government tried to regularize that, it had the unintended consequence of ruining what was a very efficient market, human capital-driven system. So what lessons can we learn also about not only educating the public, and I see Rahan Ahmed here from the Supreme Council's Waste Disposal, who writes a very good weekly column in Daily Tribune, if you see it. And I noticed one of his recent ones that Bahrain is really at the top of the environmental performance index from the World Economic Forum, first in the GCC and sixth in the Middle East region. Talk about the human habit part of this, setting policies, creating market incentives, those sorts of things that allow the population to both participate as a stakeholder, but also behave the way we need them to in order for these things to work.
Well, I'd say the first thing about human behavior is we've got to get more people to understand what they have and what to do with it. So, there's still way too much that we're just throwing out in the first place, and it doesn't matter if you have waste management or some other big company coming to collect your waste in different parts of the world, or if you have the informal network of collectors and pickers that you mentioned, which is true in many parts of the world. We've got to get the consumers and the generators of the waste in the first place, whether it's companies or individuals, residences or businesses, to be more thoughtful about what they're throwing out. My wife, who works on things like plastics reduction, she worked in California on getting a law passed to ban the use of wasteful single-use plastic bags, which, you know, when we were kids, many of us are old enough to remember when we were kids, there weren't single-use plastic bags. You know, you'd go with your canvas bag or whatever to the grocery store, you'd get your items and go to the market, you'd fill up the open-air market, you'd fill up with vegetables, with whatever it was. And then in the 70s, we started getting these wasteful single-use plastic bags, which end up clogging drains and polluting waterways, and they're just a tremendous waste of a valuable resource. So she campaigns against that, and one of the things that she reminds us is that, you know, the 3 R's are reduce, so we need to be reducing packaging in the first place. Reuse, obviously there's a lot of products that we can reuse, and electronic waste is a good example of that, when so many electronics that in our world, after a year, the iPhone 4 isn't good enough, we have to have the iPhone 5. Well, somebody else can use that old iPhone. The truth is that most of us have a lot of those old electronics sitting in our desk drawer, our dresser drawer at home, when in fact those could be used in other parts of the world. So reuse is a very important thing that we can learn in both business and with individual behavior, and then of course recycle. And so the generators of waste, be it at home or be it in business, obviously have an opportunity to make it easier for the informal pickers or the formal pickers to segregate that material in the first place. But at the end of the day, you know, we worked in Brazil on this, where the world's largest landfill was recently closed. There were generations of people who lived on that landfill, raised their kids there. There were schools there and so forth that would then, every time a truck comes up, they would pick out material. But the amount of material that still ended up as waste, that still ended up in that landfill, is breathtaking. And we've shown with technology that 95% of that material can be sorted with both labor and technology and turned back into productive resources. So a lot of it is, I think, educating people, educating the generators, but then making a place for all of those people that are currently in the economy, in the waste economy, to have a place, but in dignified jobs that are long-lasting and sustainable.
Thank you. I should also mention California is a culture leader in the U.S., so you will see people carrying to the grocery store their recyclable material bags so as not to do what they will carry their Nalgene Camelback, I'm not specifying a brand, bottles, so that they're not always just buying plastic bottles. And it's a mindset, not only with municipal water supply, but even here, when people get the large bottles delivered, that they're refilling a reusable bottle instead of simply always doing what unfortunately we did here today with Intercon.
Well, and just on that point, His Excellency Dr. Medina today had his cup. Do you have it handy there, your reusable beverage cup? He came in today with his reusable coffee cup, which saves an awful lot of wasteful styrofoam and other kinds of cups, setting a great example.
And the more people see that, the more they follow that example,
exactly,
and
yes,
because it becomes the hip thing to do.
Exactly.
We had several questions on the topic you just did, but there are a couple of different spins on it, and so I'd like to group them. If I don't get your exact point, there'll be a chance when we pass the microphone to help you clarify. But a lot of them really do focus on the difference between passing a law or a regulation. Do fines for littering really work? Where are the market incentives? What lessons have you learned? Because municipalities in the U.S. have tried all different approaches: mandatory curbside recycling, mandatory segregation of your own waste, deposits on bottles and cans, all sorts of things that go the spectrum from mandate to encouragement to market incentive. And sometimes it's a combination of all of those, I'm sure, but tell me a little bit about the lessons you've learned about what works and what doesn't, or if you're going to do all of the above, what order you do them in to encourage a community to take this seriously.
So, you know, two examples from California that I think might be useful. One is that in 1990, we passed a law that said by the year 2005, California communities would have to reduce the amount of waste going to landfills by 50%. So that gave 15 years to reduce it by 50%. They didn't say how, they didn't say what kinds of waste, they left it up to the communities to figure it out. So that led to all kinds of recycling programs, all kinds of innovation for figuring out how to use materials that were going to landfills. And it happened in 2005. I was EPA secretary, so I had to look at the data and certify whether or not we had hit that target. And in fact, California we had exceeded it. We hit 55% diversion from that 1990 baseline, so we then set a goal of 75%. So first of all, setting broad policy goals is very helpful, and it was mentioned before, this notion of sort of having maybe 10 years to get to a goal, to give people time to plan and to innovate and to invest is very important. So you set the broad goal first and then let innovation bubble up.
And I recall that also inspired competitive spirit between jurisdictions, between municipalities, sure, because they wanted to be the first to get there, they wanted there to be rated better than their neighbor, a better place to live, or other market incentives too. I mean, there's a certain amount of pride that goes into being the first to achieve that goal, right? Exactly.
And then the second one I would give as an example is a little bit narrower in focus. So for example, in 2002, we passed a law then that banned any electronic appliance or electrical appliance, could be a computer, could be an old TV, could be a vacuum cleaner. Any electrical appliance was banned from going into a landfill. So that was very specific, whereas the previous law had been all waste, you figure out how to reduce it by 50%. This was now targeting one particular industry, and it was because we were so alarmed by how much waste was now being generated. Think about the explosion of electronics from the year 2000 till 1990 until 2000, and how many more electronics there were going into landfills. But in that case, we realized that if you just told communities you cannot put the stuff in the landfill, what are they going to do with it? And we didn't want them just putting it in containers and sending it to China or somewhere else where you didn't know what would happen to it. So we created an incentive program. We said every time you buy a new television or computer or other electronic device, you're going to pay a small fee. It was anywhere from $4 to $8 for those new appliances. And that money went into a pot administered by the state to give incentives to the electronic recycling industry so that those industries could start and innovate. And they got 47 cents for every pound of electronic waste that they took in and broke apart and found a way to recycle. And that made it economical because otherwise many of the, just breaking apart an old television with maybe a lead glass cathode tube and some of those other things that really were hazardous, let alone not recyclable. It gave them the incentive to be able to afford to do that and to have the labor and the innovation to break apart some of these complex electronics and actually harvest all of the usable parts. And the point is today, we still give some incentive, but you really don't need to. It's a very profitable industry, and to your point, we started out with 2 large electronics waste recyclers in California when we passed that law. There's now over 50. And then a whole series of industries around that serve that larger industry.
And breakthroughs in battery technology have had after effects, longer storage, meaning fewer batteries manufactured, better storage for solar and other alternative energy, intermittent, they like to call it, energy sources.
Exactly. So setting broad policy and then narrowing it down to specifics, I think has worked very well.
We've had a couple of questions from the audience also on pollution, which I presume means air and other natural resources, and one specifically on ocean. Okay, we're on an island. The coastline is important here. The state you represented was the largest coastline, and it's not in the question, but I know it's on the minds of a lot of people here that a future economic development opportunity for Bahrain is tourism. And you mentioned in your opening remarks about Australia and the ignorance, but nonetheless, ecotourism is big in the US. It's a cultural phenomenon. People will travel places to see a tree of life or other thing. And so coastline is not just a matter of your living environment, but a key to economic opportunity for Californians. Help us learn a little bit from California's example on water and air.
Before we do that, you did it in your earlier question. Somebody asked whether or not fines for littering work. If the fine is big enough and if it's actually enforced, yes. But you know what worked even better? Some of you who may have spent time in America years and years ago, you may remember seeing an advertisement on television. There was a Native American by the name of Iron Eyes Cody, an Indian chief. And he was seen riding his horse in what you thought was a pristine wilderness, and then the camera tracked back and you realized it was over a freeway, and there was all this litter on the freeway, and the camera came in close to his eyes, and you just saw a tear coming out of his eyes. That motivated more children in particular to tell their parents not to throw trash out the window or not to throw trash on the highway. So that kind of creative innovation, I think, worked better even than a fine would.
And I'm also told that when Hollywood produces a movie on a topic, that it becomes in the public consciousness, not just in the United States, but everywhere that that movie is shown. So whether it's health or environment, and not just the Leonardo DiCaprios of the world going to testify before Congress, but simply if they make a movie and the subject matter is enlightening, that has a ripple effect that's even larger than the command and control.
Exactly. And getting to your question about air pollution, water pollution, coastal pollution, you know, all of that has an enormous economic consequence. Study after study shows that people want to go where they perceive the air, the water to be clean. You know, look at what's happening in China today, where it's the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day to live in Beijing, even if you're not a smoker. If you lived in Cairo, where I'm sure the numbers are very similar, literally breathtaking. A report came out from the World Health Organization recently that said that 1/4 of all deaths worldwide every year, 1/4 is attributable to air and water and other kinds of pollution. So that means we're killing our citizens, usually it's the elders and the children, the most vulnerable among us, at a prodigious rate. And so it's absolutely essential, whether it's for the economy, whether it's for the health of our citizens. In one of my slides, I mentioned what I consider a sustainable community. First and foremost is the health of the population. And of course, again, some of us are tree huggers, some of us are green down to our core. If you create clean air and water for your citizens, you're also doing it for animals, for plants, for trees, for everything else, for every other living thing. And so there's an equity issue as well. But it has a real economic consequence. I wrote a book that articulated that when we burn fossil fuels in particular, but all kinds of other air pollution in California, not only is that costing 100,000 lives every year of premature deaths, but it was costing the state of California over $10 billion a year in added health care costs to deal with asthma and air pollution-related diseases, cancer, and so forth. And that's not even taking into fact the lost productivity when a worker has asthma and can't go to work and those kinds of things. If you look at those studies, the number is even greater. So it's just more reason. But I would say this is for those of you who are policymakers, those of you who are in government, it's a very important issue to look at because usually it's not one side of the budget that pays for the other. So, for example, my agency, the California Environmental Protection Agency, had to regulate various kinds of pollution, had to try to get the polluters to cut back with fines, with taxes, with other kinds of economic incentives. But the health department was down the street in a different building. They were the ones having to spend that extra $10 billion in healthcare costs. So it was being taken out of one pocket, even if it was being put in another. So I think part of the solution is to have better cost accounting within government, where you understand what the true cost is to your government and to your citizens, and then adjust accordingly.
We have a couple of questions that I know are probably more appropriate for when we have more panelists up here in the next session, but since I have you here, I'll let you take first crack at it now instead of among the others. Talk a little bit more about electric vehicles, hydrogen, the alternative fuels, since you have and your wife have personal experience with it. What lessons, not just for Bahrain, but for the GCC more broadly?
Well, so, you know, obviously there are a lot of battery electric cars on the market today, and more of them. The Tesla is very popular, the Nissan Leaf and so forth. Toyota has, of course, a plug-in hybrid so that you can go on gasoline at some time and batteries sometime. But in truth, batteries are, as much as they've advanced, it takes a long while to charge them. They're expensive, they're heavy, they have to be recycled, and the weight of the battery means that if you want more range in your electric vehicle, you have to add more batteries, but then you're schlepping around more weight, which makes it less efficient. So I actually think the future of electric cars will be hydrogen. Hydrogen is stored in a tank in your car, and then it's converted to electricity by a fuel cell. So it's the same electric car as a Tesla. It's just that instead of carrying a heavy battery, you have a tank of hydrogen and this fuel cell. So I actually drive the Honda Clarity, which is a fuel cell vehicle, and it takes me about 5 minutes to refuel to get 300 miles more range. My friend who has a Tesla, it would take him, well, 8 hours if he charges at home, maybe 2 or 3 hours if he goes to a fast charger to get that same range. So in the future, I think electric cars will be based on hydrogen. And again, those of you in the petrochemical industry, you know we already have a lot of hydrogen. We use it to strip sulfur out of petroleum to make gasoline. We use it for lots of other things. There's many ways you can get hydrogen from sewage treatment plants, from anaerobic digestion of organic material, as well as just putting a little electricity into water to break out the hydrogen, H2O, for those of you that are chemists. And so it's abundant, it's all over. You can make hydrogen from whatever you have locally. And as I said, it's just more efficient in terms of powering the electric cars of the future. And it's an opportunity for the oil industry, because the oil industry already knows how to make and use hydrogen and can distribute it through its network of fueling stations. And it's a very similar experience. You put a pump right up to your car. There's a positive connection instead of just a nozzle, but it's the same experience. You turn on the pump, it fills your tank with hydrogen, and it's a gas instead of a liquid, but same concept. So it's very familiar for the drivers all over the world to use that concept instead of looking for this kind of plug or that kind of plug, and maybe the station isn't available, or if somebody's already using it, you got to wait until they're done charging for you to charge. So I think you're going to see hydrogen vehicles as the future of electric cars.
Well, I see a couple of people in the audience recently who I've had conversations about the automotive industry generally. There are some folks in Bahrain who believe that as the economy gets more diversified away from just oil, gas, and finance, that the manufacturing base that they have a comparative advantage vis-a-vis others is automotive and automotive parts and components. You've got aluminum, you've got petrochemical and other chemical competencies here. What will it take then, not only to have Bahrainis and the GCC consuming or buying these vehicles, but to become a leader and an investment place where they're made here?
Well, again, it's interesting, the Rocky Mountain Institute and Amory Lovins, who many of you may know, who's a great thinker on the future of our technology and our societies and our economies. He has often said that instead of powering our vehicles with petroleum, we should be making them from petroleum, because you can make these carbon composites a lot lighter and more durable and more crash resistant and so forth from petroleum. Petroleum is actually too valuable a resource to burn, if you think about it. You take it out of the ground, you burn it, it's gone. But if you instead make our cars from those materials, from the plastics, from the composites, the carbon fibers, that's what the auto industry needs, and is increasingly understanding that that's how you get lighter vehicles that are more fuel efficient. So I think the future can be in places like this with innovation. And by the way, publicity also helps. Getting people's attention on these issues helps. So you have an F1, a Formula One race coming up here this week. What better opportunity to showcase the technology of the future, even if it's only a new way of creating better composite plastic bumpers, or, as you mentioned, certain car parts or things that make the car lighter and more efficient, as well as all the way up to the entire car. That's an opportunity to showcase that and make this a center of excellence for the automotive industry, which is desperately in need of. Great.
We'll do one more before the break, because I've gotten a slew now and I really kind of want to organize them, and I see a few that are, but a couple of them relate to seeing market opportunities. So let's finish with a little bit on that, and then I think when we have the next group up here after the tea break, we'll have a great opportunity to get into the nitty-gritty. At the Kellogg Innovation Network, we talk about the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so it's a well-chosen word, but it also easily becomes a buzzword for everything everyone means for it to be, as opposed to truly creating market incentives for responsible behavior, and not just CSR, corporate social responsibility, but the kinds of choices that then become market-driven and self-enabling and return on investment, which you did. As you take on advisory roles, as you see opportunities, as you advise financiers, there are a lot of, and one question asked, which materials should we start recycling first? Where's the best ROI on becoming a recycler of one material versus another? You can answer it that way if you want, or just sort of, what are your metrics for deciding, hey, this is where a country should start, this is where a community should start, and this is where you're going to be, or how you're going to be able to attract the most investors, ROI, et cetera.
Well, this really is kind of like when you go to a big buffet and there's all kinds of food, and every one of us might go take a little of this, a little of that, but every plate would look slightly different because each of us has different dietary interests and needs and tastes. Well, this is the same thing. You have a buffet of technologies out there and opportunities to invest and innovate in the waste sector. And so if you think about what is it that a community has, and what does it need? So in Algeria, the R20 has worked with Oran to develop the first zero waste campus, very similar to what I showed up on this slide deck up here. Well, one of the things that they need is soil amendments, fertilizer and enhancements to improve their agriculture so they can have more local agriculture. So we focus a lot on the green waste and not turning that into energy, which they have a lot of, but rather into soil amendments and into feed for animals, not just anaerobic digestion, which everyone's familiar with, that is very vaguely efficient. There's gasification and other things that may be better, but where you get a byproduct that is a great soil amendment. But in addition, some of those pre-consumer food wastes, if they're collected properly, can be turned into animal feed. So now you're feeding animals for meat production and even aquaculture production from waste materials that then come back into the food supply. So there's a real opportunity to decide what is it you need in your region, because that's what's going to be the highest economic value for the output, and then work your way back to what are the technologies and what are the feedstocks that you could use, which in many cases are very flexible. There's also things that I think are very similar in regions, waste tires, for example, and human sludge from sewage treatment plants. Those are two things you can't reduce. As I mentioned, my wife always campaigns on the notion of reduce, reuse, recycle first before you convert what's left, what you can't effectively get rid of, into something else. Well, there are those two wastes from the sludge from sewage treatment plants and of course, from animal waste and from tires, which you can't really reduce. And so there are great technologies, gasification technologies, where you can turn all of that into fuels, into fertilizer, into a variety of other outputs. So looking at what you have and what you need ultimately answers that